Hi, my name is A'ndre. Welcome back to the Burn Bag podcast. Folks, as you saw over the weekend, President Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Just yesterday, on Monday, we saw a range of European leaders, plus Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, meet with President Trump at the White House. There's been a lot of noise, a lot of news about the current state of the war in Ukraine, a potential trilateral meeting between Trump, Putin, and Ukraine, and obviously questions around US support for Ukraine and what a potential peace settlement may look like and how Ukraine fares. To discuss this here today, I have retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman joining me. Alex served as a former director for European Affairs on the National Security Council. Some of you folks may remember his name. He was a key witness in the first Trump impeachment inquiry after raising concerns about President Trump's call with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Alex is now a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins Science School and is the author of The Folly of Realism, which is out today. It was a recent release. We'll maybe touch on that book a little bit during the course of this interview. But Alex currently writes extensively on US national security, Russia, and transatlantic alliances, and is a leading voice on the war in Ukraine. So, Alex, thank you for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Andre, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely. So, Alex, let's sort of talk about the strategic state of play with the war in Ukraine right now. But before we talk about that, I mean, for our audience, a lot of people have questions about US support to Ukraine. People have questions about why is US support to Ukraine really important? So, I mean, why is that support actually important, not only to Ukraine and its, fighting forces, but also to the United States and US national security?
So this is the perennial question to engage U.S. policymakers and the American public, and frankly, it needs to be made on a consistent basis because the international, national security, and domestic agendas are so busy that frankly, you need a reminder. So I'll go ahead and give my advertisement to kind of continue to evangelize this cause. Well, the first thing is what is commonly referred to as the global international order. It's something that came out of really devastating first half of the 20th century, two world wars, the Second World War, resulting in a new international architecture, UN Security Council, and out of those agreements, really kind of a consensus view that that it didn't end wars. Let's be clear, but that large interstate wars should be mitigated, minimize the possibilities of those wars, and certainly on the European plane, that we were going to do everything we could to avoid another large-scale war. Aggression in one state against another was going to be discouraged as much, deterred as much as possible. So this is the first large-scale war since World War II, and it really is destabilizing, reversing the gains of stability in a period where, again, we had Cold War, we had a confrontation, an ideological confrontation between two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US, but we managed to avoid a large-scale war. And Russia, in attacking Ukraine, has precipitated a large-scale war and a significant instability in Europe. So that's kind of almost a high-minded principle, but it also is a precedent that could be set for large states to prey on on small states, kind of a return to the rules of the jungle. If Russia is able to be successful in Ukraine, walk away with a win, um, empire building, then other uh, global and regional powers may think that this is now an acceptable new norm. And we have the potential for a confrontation in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. Certainly, the biggest thing that people tend to focus on in that theater is China-Taiwan scenarios and the effects that could have. But it also could mean other confrontations in other corners of the world. Again, the strong prey on the weak, might makes right, a return to rules of the jungle. That's the big picture. But on a practical level, we're still talking about the fact that it's a humanitarian human catastrophe. The losses, in fact, are staggering. A million, more than a million by certain counts, Russian soldiers killed or severely wounded. Probably a third of that on the Ukrainian side. Lots of losses with regards to the civilian population, cities being destroyed. So yes, there's a human and humanitarian component to it. But if you think about just kind of a most a realist view of the world, and you think about where the sources of U.S. strength are, those are connected to our alliance with NATO and our partnership with EU states. It's the strongest security relationship, and it's the strongest economic relationship with the bloc. And if we are allowing instability to unfold and expand, then we are undermining our own source of strength, the source of strength being again security, economic, diplomatic, and so forth. So there are a multitude of different reasons. I think if I would just to take this to a more basic level,
Hmm.
we are we are part of an alliance. It's a team. International relations is a team sport. It's not a bunch of countries that are just operating for themselves. And we want to make sure our team is strong because the other team seems to be getting stronger, seems to be consolidating, seems to be more aggressive. And what we want to do is we want to preserve the strength of our own team so we can deter and in the worst case scenario, defeat our adversary. So when I'm talking to the American public, I put it in those terms. I think that resonates, and you could use a football analogy if you want to, or a schoolyard bully analogy. Those work quite effectively. I also talk about this in the fact that we are paying a premium to Russia for the fact that they started this war. Part of what we are facing with regards to inflation certainly is tethered to COVID and a pandemic, but it's also tethered to instability and surge in commodity prices, whether that's food staples or um, energy resources, and that is because of Russia. So we should be mindful that if we don't want this perpetual source of economic shock and higher prices, then we might want to help Ukraine achieve its end states and end this war. And I think then we could start seeing some of the easing of some of these economic factors.
So, Alex, when we look at the current state of the war, how do you assess it? Has Russia regained the upper hand in a military sense? I mean, we're seeing reports of renewed Russian advances in Donetsk. We're seeing intensified drone strikes. What do these developments signal about the state of the war on the ground?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that Russia has retained or regained the upper hand. I mean, they had it certainly in the opening days of the war when Ukraine was reeling. Relatively quickly, Ukraine was able to regain its footing and make some gains. I think it's important to realize that this war has ebbed and flowed repeatedly. It's had cycles where the Russians look strong, and then the Ukrainians have some kind of stunning asymmetric responses and things of that nature. Certainly, in the air and sea theaters, I think the balance tipped in favor of Ukraine with regards to defense. That balance has kind of swung a little bit more to balanced with regards to Russia expanding its air attacks, whether that's drones or cruise missile attacks. That's, I think, what you're referring to with regards to Russia's improving conditions. But on the ground, outside of those relatively robust swings in the first year or so, it's really been a complete grind. And the Russians, in spite of their superior numbers and at one point superior equipment when this war started, were never really able to achieve kind of decisive results. They've had some gains, whether it's of Diivka. They've had some kind of penetrations that people are talking about now, but nothing that's likely to amplify into anything decisive. And I would say that you know, in the best case scenario, and kind of Putin's um, pretty bold aspirations over the course of a long war, he thinks he could apply pressure and squeeze Ukraine and use that mismatch in industrial strength and economic size and manpower, and through attritional warfare, continue to inch forward and make gains. And in that kind of scenario, Ukraine just the strength kind of saps, and Ukraine folds. But that's his view. The reality is something probably closer to a more favorable situation for the Ukrainians, in which they are bleeding Russia um, with regards to material expenditures, massive material expenditures. The Russians can't produce enough military material. They're reverting to really kind of human wave type attacks, or if not human wave, at least kind of
Mm.
just manned a small assaults. And then in exchange for making relatively modest gains on the battlefield, tactical gains, they're losing a lot. So in that kind of scenario, I actually think that Ukraine has more staying power, and that Russia can't endure the kinds of losses it's facing, um, even if it becomes more costly with regards to air attacks. And Ukraine suffers because it's not getting adequate support from the U.S. with regards to air defenses or interceptors or artillery. There doesn't seem to be anything on the near horizon with a decisive tipping point in Russia's favor. I think right now it's in balance, slightly tipped towards Ukraine with regards to staying power.
Yeah, and so we're certainly talking about that in a militarial sense, but now in sort of more of a domestic political sense for the Ukrainians. I mean, I've seen some reports about, Ukrainian troop morale fraying, public
Yeah.
support for continuing the war weakening, that it seems like more Ukrainians are now in favor of a peace deal. How should we interpret Ukraine's capacity and willingness to actually keep fighting under the current conditions? Because while you say, right, like militarily, it's more 50-50. It ebbs and flows. Ukraine has some advantages in some aspects. How should we interpret it from the political sense and the willingness to keep the war going?
Sure. So I would say that the society as a whole is under significant strain. There's a regular, I mean, the oppression of 3.5 years of war
Yeah.
has taken its toll. But the data I've seen seems to indicate that Ukraine, as a whole, has quite a bit of staying power. So there, I think, under some negotiated outcomes with security guarantees, um, you could see that Ukrainian society rally behind this idea of winding down the war, but kind of what would be a favorable, enduring security for Russia, from Russia. But I think what I'm also seeing is that under the conditions that Russia is demanding, which is really capitulation,
Yeah.
that there is no real appetite for that, because they understand the consequences of that are enormous suffering for swaths of the population, perpetual kind of risk and pressure of Russian attack. There is an interesting gap between where society has been for a long time and where the military has been. I think the military has had a much more kind of balanced and reserved view of what could be achieved on the battlefield without talking, and morale has maybe softened. Certainly it doesn't help when the one of the biggest backers of Ukraine is become um ambivalent at best.
Mhm.
But there's desertion numbers have increased, but the force is still intact, and I think part of this is the fact that there's a perception that the military brass may not be entirely effective or sufficiently concerned about the lives of the soldiers. And if they prove themselves to be more effective leaders, I think that would go a long way to bolstering morale. I think the society started out very, very keen on fighting for every inch of territory, and was very um, robust in its support for defending every inch of Ukraine, and that has kind of softened under the reality of Russia's regular air attacks, and they've come closer
Yeah.
to, they've started to converge a little bit with the military's more balanced view. So you see some of that, but I'd say the data I'm seeing is proves they're a society that's quite resilient, um, under pressure, but quite resilient.
So, what do you make of recent Ukrainian attacks inside Russia? I think we saw some reports around a pipeline strike, for example. Do these signal sort of escalation with the war or strategic calibration? And would attacks like that, could they potentially reshape, international perceptions of the war?
It's interesting. I'd say
Yeah.
these attacks, frankly, probably from a military standpoint, are a necessity, but Ukraine has been restrained and reserved in that they understand, especially under the Biden administration, they were kind of warned off from these kinds of attacks because they were told that it would weaken societal support from the West because of the increase in oil and gas prices. From a military standpoint, I think it would have been in Ukraine's interest to do that, to apply additional pressure on Russia, but they've been restrained. I think under the situation where the U.S. has actually undermined its own leverage, is only really at this point providing relatively modest support with regards to intelligence sharing, isn't going to do any more of these large packages. Um, whether it's presidential drawdowns or whatever the case might be, they're only interested in selling. I think that actually in certain regards, and the more clarity there is around Trump's favoring Russia and sidelining Ukraine, the more of these kinds of attacks we're likely to see, because then that whole kind of council of don't do this, it's going to undermine support. Well, where is the support anyway? I would say that the Ukrainians have been going after energy targets for consistently, really, for most of this war, as their capabilities expand. They've stayed away from the pipelines because pipelines, in certain regards, are frankly more meaningful for global oil and gas trades. But I think that they're signaling that this is a legitimate target set, and if the U.S. is not going to be there in support of Ukraine, then Ukraine is going to do what they need to in order to try to put additional pain on Russia, and trade those tactical gains that Russia is making on the battlefield for some economic pain that they can inflict with these strategic attacks. I think that's the way I look at it.
Let's now turn to the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska that just took place just a few days ago. What did you make of the summit? What were your initial reactions to the summit? And how does perhaps the events from yesterday, Monday, the European leaders meeting at the White House with President Zelenskyy, with President Trump, did that change your initial outlook on the Alaska summit?
So I would call it a mitigated disaster instead of an unmitigated disaster. I had a visceral reaction to it, disgust. In a lot of ways, it's a bit personal because my first day on the job on the National Security Council was the Helsinki summit. So instead of doing, the typical kind of government bureaucratic and processing, getting computer accounts, I was basically putting out fires
Gee.
and addressing press inquiries. And what was shocking, and I've talked about this a little bit, so this is we'll cover a little bit of new ground, and my latest thinking is Trump was relatively well prepared. He is notoriously hard to prepare. He doesn't think he needs preparation. He doesn't think he needs the background. He doesn't think he needs to, understand that, like, the issues and how an adversary can manipulate. He has a lot of confidence in himself. He was nervous for this one. He understood. He had a respect for Putin, so he was prepared. And the reason I say this is, if you listen to his remarks on Air Force One inbound to Alaska, he actually, kind of laid out some points that made it clear that he had a position that he was going to go in and advocate. So he was prepared, as hard as that is to do. it fell apart on contact. He was easily manipulated. And this is what's disturbing about Trump as a national leader, um, that when push comes to shove, he is not necessarily capable of managing crises. Actually, I said that as an analyst. Let me be a little bit more frank. He is incapable. He's simply incapable of managing crises. And I think the lessons for the Chinese and the Russians are that he is likely to fold when faced with a challenge going forward. The reason I say this is the same way that Putin played Trump in Helsinki, talking to him about the fact that Trump won fair and square, that Russia wasn't involved, and this is of course aligned with Trump's own narrative. He was able to feed lines around this war would never have happened if you were president, from Putin, or lines like voting by mail is notoriously unreliable, and distracted him with these things and really delivered nothing of substance on the reason that Trump was there. I mean, the idea was that Trump was going to go in and kind of make the case for and compel, uh, coerce, encourage a ceasefire, and then advance the cause of negotiations. Instead, Trump completely reversed course on the idea of a ceasefire, put the onus initially, before this meeting occurred yesterday, back on Zelenskyy, as Zelensky's the actor that could settle the war by accepting, basically what amounts to capitulation. And all these other broader ideas of, like, economic, those things didn't even occur. I mean, they had on paper they had a 2.5 hour meeting, but in reality it was probably an hour and 15 because of the translators. So it was a relatively short meeting and nothing to gain except for Trump looking like he was pandering to Putin, a war criminal, Putin getting a red carpet treatment, and so forth. So where did the I had some, of course, questions over the weekend what this would amount to, and so did our European allies in Ukraine, and they settled on what amounted to an effective strategy. They came in force. They came with the explicit ultimatum. They didn't have to say it, that you need to choose between your allies and your enemy. And you might like Putin, but your relationships are with us. So I think those leaders, we're talking about the core: Germany, France, UK, but also Italy and Finland, primarily because of the prime minister. I don't want to misspeak now. I don't want, but the stop,
Leader.
yeah, leader. There we go. Um, has a particularly good relationship with Trump. So I think it's the president. Sorry, I just so um, and what they managed to do is, frankly, get a get the pressure off Zelensky. So it wasn't on Zelensky to then kind of accept the deal. And Zelensky himself actually settled on a very effective tactic. He settled on this really interesting idea of, like, I'm not going to say no to land swaps, which is what Trump thought was the easiest way to get to a deal. You give up this land, Russia will end the war, uh, and ambiguous security guarantees at best. But instead, he said, "I'm ready to meet with Putin. We could talk about land swaps then." Which is then puts it back on Putin to whether he takes this meeting, and Putin doesn't want to take this meeting with Zelensky because he doesn't want to legitimize Zelensky. The other thing that was really interesting, I thought, was this question about security guarantees. On Sunday morning, Stephen Witkoff and Secretary Rubio talked about security guarantees, and they talked about NATO-like security guarantees, but in a way that was really more of a dangle, not particularly substantive. Because if you're talking about security guarantees that are NATO-like, why are you not talking about NATO, which has an existing structure? Article 5 leaves lots of latitude for the U.S. to decide what kind of support it wants to provide, but that would be the most effective way to take the security guarantee forward. Instead, it was left in a relatively ambiguous, but with a kind of a demand that at least the U.S. sell large quantities of weapons. So all in all, the reception for Zelenskyy looked good. The meetings yesterday, Monday, went well. So it kind of clawed back some decent outcomes from what looked like a pretty darn awful meeting on Friday.
So, Alex, there's a lot to unpack there in that answer. And I think so. I want to sort of first focus on that Trump Putin summit. You gave your unvarnished thoughts on it. And you sort of talk about, Trump looking nervous before going in for that meeting with Putin. It looked like he was prepared. You have noted in this interview and in other sort of media outlets before that Trump is notoriously hard to prepare for, meetings with Putin. But I mean, it seems, I mean, from what you're describing, it seems like a lot of improvise visional, sorry, I can't even say the word. It seems like Trump
Mhm.
is improvising diplomacy, basically, with Putin. Uh, how is Putin seeking to basically exploit that? Like how is Putin exploiting this improvising by Trump?
Yeah.
It's a
So I
brilliant
think
strategy.
yeah, part of this is also, yeah, it is definitely, he's going into this well trained and well prepared because he's been the president and or prime minister of Russia for 25 years. Um, and if you include a short stint with Clinton, 5 U.S. presidents. So he's sat across the table from these folks, and he knows, what's tried and true. He knows that he could steal the air. Westerners in particular are going to be courteous and hear him out. And he could steal the air and lay out his grievances. He could talk about, the different agreements he's had along the way, the promises made and broken. And I went so far as to say he could say that, Obama promised X or Biden promised Y, and they didn't follow through, and that's why we ended up here. Would have never happened with you, Donald. And these are the kinds of things that he does on a habitual basis. I mean, this is a guy that there's like a kind of in diplomatic circles, there's a kind of this famous instance in which Angela Merkel, fearful of dogs, he
Yeah.
had his German Shepherd with him for a talk just to intimidate her and get her off balance. So he is very, very well practiced. And Trump improvising, thinking that he could score points, get a deal just on charisma, is completely unprepared for these kinds of engagements.
So, I mean, in terms of how we actually saw the summit play out from a procedural level, from a logistical level, was any of this necessarily normal? Would it have been normal for Putin to come to Alaska, given the key tensions that we have with the Russians right now? Was it normal to see sort of a leaked menu showing that I think Putin would have eaten, I think, halibut and filet mignon, given all the tensions and the issues
Yeah,
we have with the Russians? Was the red carpet normal? Was that military flyover
yeah,
normal? Like, is any of
yeah,
this normal for a meeting with a key
yeah.
adversary?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, first of all, what is normal is that Russians love their surf and turf. So, yeah, that's normal. But I think the rest of this is highly abnormal because it again highlights that Trump doesn't understand history, doesn't care for. I mean, even recent history. We're talking about like what's happened over the past 6 months seems irrelevant. It's what's in front of him, which is an interesting way to operate. Putin is a has a warrant for his arrest from the International Criminal Court. In 123 countries, he would be arrested and sent to The Hague for trial. And instead, the sole superpower has rolled out the red carpet for this war criminal.
Literally,
Huh?
literally a red
Yeah,
carpet.
yeah. And so that is very, very strange. There was the show of this kind of welcome to a fellow head of state. Yes, we want, there you could make a. I'm sure the Russians demanded kind of head of state protocols, but we didn't have to agree to them. I mean, Putin would have been totally happy with having a couple of cameramen there just to to have the meeting face to face on Alaskan soil. There were lots of different giveaways. This meeting didn't need to occur in the United States. It could have occurred in like some third country that is not a signatory to International Criminal Court. And I know we're not a signatory to it as well, but at least we're kind of like we're supposed to be a principled stakeholder and stuff like that. So could have occurred somewhere else. Could have occurred in Saudi Arabia or something like that. Some third a neutral third territory. Um, the warm greeting. I mean, one of the basic things that you get, and he tried it a little bit, frankly, you could see that he struggled with it, is that you don't necessarily, smile and pat your adversary on the back. Like it's diplomacy 101. When we met with the Russians, when I was part of delegations, whether it's military or diplomatic, it was it was cool and appropriate for in recognition of the fact that you're talking to an adversary. So yeah, maybe Trump fancies himself as having a kind of a warm relationship, but for this one, for the cameras, he could have kept it a little bit cool, and he couldn't manage that. And then, the show of force, which was kind of uh, maybe somewhat meaningful, the flanked by the F-22 Raptors and the B-2 flyover and stuff like that, to show U.S. strength, was immediately undermined by a ride in the beast. So, I mean, all of these things just looked like they're pretty absurd. The press conference where like Putin reads a statement with kind of a glowing review and giddy at how things turned out, and Trump kind of playing the part of Eeyore and kind of just mopey and short comments. He didn't read anything. It was just, off the cuff, providing some comments on the fact that it was a 10 meeting when even his bearing indicated otherwise. And immediately Fox News kind of just saying, like not even knowing how to deal with that because it was clearly pretty awful. So no, not much of it was normal. The follow-up meeting with seven heads of state or world leaders coming together, not normal, to try to keep the U.S. on sides and prevent the relationship from completely going off the reservation. There's really nothing normal about anything Trump does. I mean, he then proceeds to talk about on the domestic plane how he needs to do away with mail-in ballots, something that like Putin delivered to him and he parroted. None of this is normal.
So I know, like with the European leaders, I think there was a lot of reporting and sort of the image of these European leaders coming to the White House right after the summit seemed for many to indicate that, like, they wanted to prevent Zelenskyy from being bullied in the White House. I mean, we saw that back in February, the Trump-Zelenskyy shouting match, Vice President Vance sort of interjecting, why haven't you said thank you? And all of that. I think Secretary of State Rubio, however, said that this meeting with the European leaders had been pre-planned for weeks in advance. So, like, I mean, what do you make of this? Do you think it was planned like in haste? Do you think it was sort of pre-planned by the White House? Uh,
Yeah,
what do
that's a
you?
bunch of BS. That's a bunch of BS. I mean, the summit itself wasn't planned weeks ago. The summit was planned like it was on the fly a week before is when the sun came up out of a call. And some people will argue it's a distraction from the domestic scandals. So it wasn't planned weeks ago. It's possible in the preparation. These are savvy, competent leaders. They said on the back end, we'd like a call. Maybe we should have a meeting, but I don't think that Trump necessarily had plans to meet Zelensky. He was, again, management. He decided to have this meeting to have a more positive visual than the horrible visual of meeting with Putin. And in that, I think the European leaders kind of scrambled and said, yes, we should come to and join. I don't think this was, I mean, is it possible that it was a late, in preparation for the summit ad? Could it have been something added after this, just as the summit was going on? Yes, but it was definitely not something that was planned, as a counterpart to the Trump Putin summit.
Do you believe that there was some success with, I think, Monday's summit of European leaders in projecting some sense of unity, or is that something that's just a facade? And I guess for Putin, does Putin view that sort of sense of unity between the US, Ukraine, and Europe as a facade?
Yeah. So I don't think he sees any unity between the U.S. and Europe and Ukraine, but he certainly says the European unity with Ukraine registers, and that's meaningful. I mean, is Europe in a position to fight a protracted war with Russia, or is Russia prepared to do the same thing, frankly, because of the punishment that they're taking Ukraine, is not entirely clear. I'd say the Europeans have certainly underinvested in their own security, and their $1 billion or trillion euro investment is going to go a long way to fix that. And a combined economy of the EU and NATO, somewhere on the order of about 20 trillion, 10 times bigger than Russia, certainly all that registers. So I think he understands that. He understands that there is a seam between the U.S. and Europeans and Ukraine that he's attempting to exploit. Um, I do think that the Europeans and Ukraine did come out um, salvaging what was shaping up to be a scenario in which Trump threw his hands in the air and said, "Not my problem, I'm out," type of thing, which could have also implicated whatever residual support we have, could have implicated the weapons sales, but depending on his kind of temperament, he could easily swing in that direction. Um, and a situation in which the last person to talk to him was Putin, and notoriously Trump is a person that the last person that speaks to him, that's the seed that he's got planted in his mind, and that's what he carries forward. So having those meetings, robust meetings, I think was a very good thing. And it also puts the onus back on Putin. Again, a game of chess. Now Putin has to accept this bilateral meeting between Russia and Ukraine. He's not going to want to do that. So potentially he looks like the impediment to peace again, and then maybe that gets Trump thinking about, well, maybe it's time to pull the trigger on sanctions. The bottom line is, and kind of a glaring oversight, but one of the other major accomplishments that Putin had was he basically killed this idea of consequences on Russia from the U.S. anytime soon.
Yeah.
That is going to be a weeks long process, probably before you know we hear noises of sanctions and things of that nature again.
I mean, also, like, I mean, when you think about it, right? Like, I mean, President Trump has been saying, oh, both sides have to make concessions. Secretary Rubio has sort of parroted that line as well. But I mean, the fact is, Russia invaded Ukraine. They are occupying parts of Ukraine. I mean, Russia could end the war by just going back to Russia. And I mean, now we're also seeing, I think during that summit, right, like Putin offered peace, quote unquote, but he wants the Donbass, basically. He wants to keep those pieces of land that he has taken. He wants to keep parts of sovereign Ukraine. That offer, I think, to keep the Donbass in exchange for some element of peace, is that a serious offer? Is it sort of BS? Is it a provocation? Is
Yeah.
it a provocation that's meant to sow discord between Ukraine and the United States, or what do you make of that?
I think it's that the third item you mentioned. It's a provocation intended to sow discord, where it seemed that Putin is offering a reasonable deal,
Mhm.
modest change in territory. It's not that modest, but in the big scale of things, maybe a modest change of territory. Ukraine accepts a de facto Russian control of the Donbass, and the war ends with kind of ambiguous security guarantees, but it's really in a lot of ways a non-starter. I do think that there's going to be a scenario at some point where this war settles out with territorial questions unanswered.
Yes.
Crimea, the territory that Russia has been occupying since 2014. I think those things will have to be set aside realistically, even though it's far than optimal. But he's then asking, as a poison pill, Ukraine to give up a significant portion of the Donbass. I saw some interesting commentary. 9 cities with tens of thousands of people. I think about a half, or more than a half a million people, that would then be given over to Russia for occupation or evacuated. Significant territories. The defensive lines that Ukraine has spent a decade, in some cases, a decade, kind of building and then really ramping up and reinforcing, and a vulnerability for Russia to exploit after potentially a short pause to target other cities, whether that's Dnipro or Poltava or further towards central Ukraine. So I don't think this was a serious offer. I think if it were a serious offer, maybe maybe it would be freezing the lines where they are potentially.
Mhm.
It could be something along the lines of, accepting, because there are different formats for NATO, by the way. I mean, we think about it as kind of like a singular agreement, but when we expanded NATO East, we did it with this idea of no permanent troops in Eastern Europe, and for a long time we had rotational presence, and it really kind of expanded after Russia's aggression starting in 2008 and 2014. But we could have probably done a format where it's NATO, but no, permanent troop presence, or some other parameters. Like then you include conventional forces Europe type treaty parameters in it to layer on top of NATO. So that would be a reasonable way to go. That would be a kind of a much more substantive security guarantee. I think that mainly this was Putin planting seeds to sow discord between the U.S. and Europeans, to sow discord in the U.S. body politic, to put the pressure back on Ukraine as the impediment to Trump's ideas of a peace and a Nobel Peace Prize, and to bolster and burnish Russia's image and kind of normalize Russia. And on all those counts, and then dissuade this idea of like sanctions or punishment or ratcheting up pressure on Russia. On all those counts, Putin was successful.
Do you think that Trump's efforts to get three of them in a room, Putin, Zelensky, and Trump in one room, do you think there's any value in that? Do you think there's some element of pragmatism in it, or do you think it's a very naive approach? Do you think that, I mean, that, say, this type of thing would allow Putin to dictate the terms of any negotiation?
Yeah, I think the trilateral format would be troubling because the U.S. wouldn't be either a neutral arbiter or fulfilling its kind of historical role, a partner and an ally to Ukraine. So it would be a situation in which potentially you have pressure coming from Russia and the U.S. on Ukraine. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we've done that before. Like when we were trying to get Ukraine to denuclearize in the 90s, we did that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something I talk about in my book. But I think that's a dangerous situation. I think a bilateral would be interesting. I don't know if, first of all, I'm very dubious, at least in the near term, that Putin will take it because he wouldn't want to legitimize Zelensky. He says that the Kiev government is not is illegitimate. There was a coup and all these other things, so he wouldn't want to do that without something pretty substantive in the path towards peace. Um, but if they did, let's say we set that aside, and if they did meet, maybe there's a frank conversation that I mean, I'm also curious. Zelensky has said that he's willing to meet with Putin, but what utility he necessarily sees, because Russia is still feeling quite confident, feels confident in this attritional warfare strategy. It is still demanding maximalist outcomes. So I think right now these are not serious overtures for bilateral or trilateral meetings. I think it's something that's likely to happen eventually, but not right now under the current conditions.
Is Zelensky's and is Ukraine's, is their sense of agency being rapidly depleted, by the Washington Moscow talks, by
Mm.
Trump's perceived favoration of Putin in this sense. Do we see Zelensky's capital being rapidly extinguished, or do you think there's still opportunity for Ukraine to have agency in this process? And if so, I mean, like, what does Ukraine need to do? I mean, because it feels like they're being boxed
Yeah,
in.
yeah. I would say that the election of Donald Trump saw Zelensky's currency diminish. It just the proclivity of Trump to want to have a relationship with Putin, an affinity for Putin, and an animus for Zelensky. But that's also um, a kind of a bit of a shallow loss of currency, because the fact is that Ukraine will ultimately, be the deciding factor in how this war turns out. It's not a small state, it's a robust state. It's defending itself against, what was formerly considered or inherited the mantle of a superpower, from the Soviet Union. And Ukraine will make a decision on what's best for its own sovereignty, regardless of what Trump wants. They want to keep Trump engaged on sides. They want to keep him in the intelligence relationship flowing. They want to be able to open up the aperture for weapons sales to sustain Ukraine's war effort. So that's the real kind of there probably is some misplaced optimism about the fact that they could really work with the Trump administration. It's something I've talked to,
Yeah.
before I talked to Ukrainian leaders about, that they shouldn't have illusions or delusions about that. And maybe they did. I think they have a much more kind of realistic view of what they could accomplish. And I think it's more closer to what I just laid out, narrow relationship where the U.S. stays on side, supports through sales, is probably the best case scenario. So yes, I think he may have lost some of his currency, but ultimately it doesn't make a difference. Ukraine and Zelensky will be, kind of the deciding factors on as this for this war to wind down.
So for future negotiations, I mean, what are some of the red lines that must not be crossed? I mean, I feel like we've already crossed some red lines at this point, but I mean, like, what are the key non-negotiables for the United States, for Ukraine, but also for NATO, that must
Yeah.
anchor any ongoing peace process?
Yeah, I think the ones that seem to me most flexible are potentially the Russian red lines. I think because Putin's a strong man and he is still enjoys a level of popularity, and if he needs to, he could crack down if there are protests. He could accept a lot of distasteful things. He doesn't need to subdue Ukraine. He doesn't need to retain that even the territory, all the territory that Ukraine that they've secured since 2022. He could take something as modest as de facto recognition of Crimea and the Donbass, and probably be okay with that. Although then he has to explain, what was gained. I think the Europeans are in a different situation. They, especially, and there's a divide between Eastern and Western Europeans, they see a scenario in which Putin walking away with a win um, allows him to reset and potentially advance his imperialist cause going forward in other corners, hybrid or direct military confrontation. So I think the Europeans are going to want to define something that looks like a loss
Mhm.
and makes Putin reluctant. The Ukrainians, they can't achieve their desire for Ukraine in its 1991, internationally recognized borders. They would probably accept something going back to status quo ante February 2022, or with security guarantees, maybe Russia, some Russian gains locked in. I think it would be hard. Maybe one of the areas that um, Ukraine might have to accept Russian occupation over under the right circumstances, maybe even this land bridge scenario. But maybe that's that. So some some kind of parameters there. Um, Red lines, I think, giving away territory that Russia currently doesn't control. I think it is definitely straying towards a red line when you start to think about Russia, Russian gains since February 2022. But again, like I said, there were some areas to negotiate. For the U.S., I mean, I don't know. I mean, with Donald Trump, I don't think there are any red lines. He could, for whatever reason, he could throw Europe and Ukraine under the bus on one hand, or seeing the fact that he's getting embarrassed by Putin, pivot and a reverse course and sanction. So we don't really have a policy or a strategy right now. We have the whims of, an individual that has his, kind of a worldview that he wants to have the relationships with these strong men and stuff like that. But that could easily be changed. So we're we're probably the most liquid.
As we round this conversation out, what should our audience be looking out for in the coming days and weeks as we see maybe, negotiations continue on forward? I mean, this is a very fluid situation. What should our listeners be looking out for?
I think the next engagement is likely to be something where there's a U.S. Russia dialogue around this idea of a bilat, and more than likely Russia's going to come back with yes, but again, with not a sincere desire for a bilateral, but a parameter that makes it unacceptable, and then it comes back to Ukraine and the Europeans to then explain why this is not, this is a poison pill and not a way to go. I don't think we have any ability for a breakthrough. What I think we should be looking out for is a Europe that's continuing to be recalibrated and further resolved and prepared to put resources behind bolstering Ukraine and buying, U.S. Material in support of Ukraine. That's probably the biggest substantive things that we should be looking out for progress on that front. Um, because this shuttle diplomacy, these engagements with Putin are not likely to yield results. It's what I've been saying really since just about the this well, at least the summer of 22, which is the only way that you convince Putin to relent is by demonstrating that he cannot be successful on the battlefield, that there are significant costs um, from a security perspective as well as economic. And unless we do that, this war is likely to grind on with Putin, regularly emboldened to stay the course, even if it gets hard sometimes, because of the different prizes he get, all the gifts he gets from Trump, and the potential fractures and chaos that occur in this relationship. So, um, unfortunately, I think we're in for war. Um, for at least the next year, I guess.
Gotcha. Well, Alex, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Thank you for your insights, for sharing some of your own experiences, and your insights really grounded in those experiences. For our audience, Alex's book, The Folly of Realism, is out right now. He has a bunch of other great conversations sort of talking about that book, talking about the ideas behind that book. But for now, Alex, thank you so much.
Thank you.